Hello and welcome to the Vailrun Tapes. Every story here is true. It happened to a real person, and they wrote it down or said it out loud, so the rest of us would know. Tonight, I'll share a few of them with you. A lot of you come back here every night, and that means a lot to me. These stories stay with people. That's just what they do. Before we start, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. I read all of them. And if you like these stories, a quick like and subscribe really help. Now get comfortable, take a slow breath, and let's begin.
When I was in elementary school, I had a small group of girls over to my house for a sleepover. I do not remember every detail of that night anymore. It was a long time ago, and like most childhood sleepovers, there was probably a lot of talking, laughing, snacks, and moving from room to room. Nothing about the evening was supposed to be serious. At some point, two of the girls and I separated from the rest of the group and went into my brother's bedroom. We were not hiding. We were not trying to scare anyone or play a prank. We simply went into the room to sit on the floor and talk. There were three of us. I was religious, and one of the other girls was religious too. The third girl was not. As we sat there, our conversation somehow became about God, faith, and what it meant to be born again. At that age, we did not understand religion with the complexity adults might bring to it. We understood it in the straightforward way children often do. You believed in God. You prayed. You tried to be a good person. And being saved meant something important had changed inside you. The third girl listened to us talk. Eventually, she said she wanted that too. She wanted to pray and be saved. So the three of us prayed together. I do not remember the exact words. I do not know how long we were in the room. In my memory, it did not feel especially long. We were sitting on the floor in my brother's bedroom with the light on, talking quietly and praying. Nothing strange happened inside the room. There were no voices, no shadows, no objects moved. We did not feel frightened. If anything, the moment felt calm. Afterward, we got up and went back to join the other girls. That was when the situation became strange. The rest of the group was angry with us. They wanted to know where we had been. At first, I thought they were simply annoyed because we had disappeared from the sleepover for a while. Maybe they felt excluded. Maybe they had wanted us to join a game or watch something with them. We told them exactly where we had been. We were in my brother's room. That should have ended the conversation. It did not. One of the girls insisted that we were lying. She said she had gone looking for us. She had checked my brother's bedroom. According to her, no one had been inside. She also said the lights had been off. That made no sense to us. The three of us knew where we had been. We had been sitting on the floor in that room together. We had talked. We had prayed. And the light had been on. There was no confusion about which bedroom it was. It was my house. I knew my brother's room. The other two girls knew where we had gone. We had not accidentally been in another room. Yet this girl was completely certain that when she checked the bedroom, it was empty and dark. At first, it probably turned into the kind of argument children have all the time. We were in there. No, you weren't. Yes, we were. I looked. None of us had evidence. There was no reason for the three of us to lie about sitting in a bedroom. There was also no obvious reason for the other girl to invent the fact that she had checked. The simplest explanation is that she checked at a different time. Maybe she went into the room before we entered. Perhaps she looked after we had already left. At a sleepover, people move around constantly. Children are rarely paying close attention to the exact time. What felt like one continuous period to us may have involved more movement than any of us remembered. She might have looked into the bedroom only a few minutes before we went in, and later remembered it as happening while we were missing. That would explain everything. She saw an empty, dark room. Later, she realized we had disappeared and assumed she had checked during the same period. We, meanwhile, had been in the room at a slightly different time. Childhood memory is not precise enough to rule that out. Another possibility is that she opened the door only briefly. Maybe she did not turn on the light or step all the way inside. If we were sitting on the floor beside the bed, furniture could have blocked her view. My brother's bedroom may have had areas that were not visible from the doorway. She could have looked in, seen what appeared to be an empty room, and closed the door. If the main light was actually on, though, that explanation becomes harder. She specifically remembered darkness. But even that could be a mistake. Perhaps the hallway was brighter than the bedroom, making the room appear dark when she glanced inside. Maybe a lamp was on, rather than the ceiling light. There may have been enough light for us to sit and talk comfortably, without the room looking brightly lit from the doorway. I do not remember the exact lighting setup. The three of us simply remember that we were not praying in darkness. There is also the possibility that another girl at the sleepover told her the room was empty, and over time the memory became her own. Children influence one another easily. One person says, "I checked there," and another agrees. Years later, a shared story can become more certain than the original event. That may be what happened. But at the time, their anger felt genuine. They had been looking for us. They believed we had gone somewhere else, and at least one of them believed she had physically checked the exact room where we said we had been. What makes the memory stand out to me now is what we had been doing inside. If we had simply been talking about school or playing with toys, the missing time aspect would still have been strange, but probably forgettable. Instead, the three of us had been praying. The girl who was not religious had just decided she wanted to be saved. Then we walked out and were told that somehow we had not been in the room at all. At that age, the religious interpretation was difficult to avoid. It felt as if the room had been hidden. Maybe we were protected somehow. Maybe the moment was meant to remain private between the three of us. I do not know if we actually said those things at the time, but the thought certainly became connected to the memory. There is a comforting version of the story where the three of us entered that room, prayed together, and for some reason, no one outside could see us. In that version, the darkness the other girls saw was not a mistake. The room was simply unavailable to her for those few minutes. I cannot prove that. There are too many ordinary explanations. But the thought became much more powerful years later. The three of us who had been in my brother's room remained friends. We continued through middle school and then high school. Childhood friendships often fade when people grow older, but ours lasted. That meant the night of the sleepover was not only some isolated memory involving girls I never saw again. The people involved remained part of my life. We changed. We grew older. Our beliefs probably became more complicated. We developed different personalities and went through all the normal things teenagers experience. The girl who had prayed with us that night remained part of that story. Then, when we were 22, she died in a terrible car accident. It was sudden. There was no chance to prepare. One moment, she was part of our lives. Then she was gone. My other friend and I were devastated. Losing someone young is difficult in a particular way because there is so much future attached to them. At 22, almost everything is still ahead. There are careers, relationships, families, trips, mistakes, changes, and ordinary years that everyone assumes will happen. When someone dies that young, all of that disappears at once. There's grief for the person, but also grief for everything they never had the chance to become. After her death, the memory of that sleepover came back differently. I thought about the three of us sitting on my brother's floor. I thought about the conversation about God. I thought about her saying she wanted to be saved. I thought about all three of us praying together. And then I thought about the other girls insisting that the room had been dark and empty. The connection was impossible not to notice. It created a sense that maybe that childhood moment had mattered more than we understood. Maybe nothing supernatural happened. Maybe a child simply checked the room at the wrong time. But after our friend died, the memory became comforting. If our beliefs from childhood meant anything, then the prayer was important. It gave us something to hold on to. I do not want to turn her death into evidence of a supernatural event. A terrible car accident years later does not prove that something protected or hid us during a sleepover. The events were separated by more than a decade. There is no logical reason to assume one predicted the other. Millions of children pray together. Some of them later die young. Human beings naturally connect emotionally powerful events, especially after loss. We look backward and find moments that seem like signs. A conversation becomes prophetic. A goodbye becomes meaningful. A strange childhood experience starts to feel like preparation. That may be exactly what happened here. The sleepover felt unusual because of the argument afterward. Her death made the memory emotionally significant. The two events combined in our minds because they both involve the same person and the same question of faith. That does not make the connection supernatural, but it also does not erase how meaningful it feels. I am now in my 40s. The other girl who was in the room with us is still my best friend. We have known each other through childhood, adolescence, young adulthood, and into middle age. We are the two people still here who shared that particular moment with our friend. Strangely, we almost never talk about it. As far as I can remember, we have discussed it only once over all these years. I think that says something about how the memory affects us. It is not a story we constantly repeat to convince ourselves it was paranormal. We do not sit around building theories about what happened in my brother's bedroom. We have lived entire lives since then. There have been marriages, work, family problems, ordinary days, and decades of other memories. Yet that one night has remained. Sometimes experiences become more powerful when they are rarely discussed. There is no constant retelling to change them. No one keeps adding details. The memory simply sits in the background. We both know it happened. We both know what we remember. And we both know who was sitting on the floor with us. When I think about the room itself, I try to reconstruct how the other girl could have missed us. Maybe the door was mostly closed. Did she actually open it all the way? I do not know. Maybe she only walked past and looked through a small gap. If we were sitting low on the floor, she could easily fail to see us. Perhaps she called our names from the hallway. If we were praying quietly, we might not have responded. She then assumed the room was empty. But why remember the lights as off? Maybe someone turned them off after we left. Perhaps she checked later, not during the prayer. The sequence may have become confused because everyone was moving through the house. That is probably the most practical explanation. I also wonder whether the other girls knew exactly how long we were gone. Children can dramatically overestimate time. 10 minutes may feel like an hour when you are waiting for friends to come back. Their anger may have made the disappearance seem longer than it actually was. Maybe we were in my brother's room for only a few minutes. One girl checked before we went inside. Then, she returned to the group. Shortly afterward, we entered the room, prayed, and came out. From our perspective, we had been there the whole time we were away. From her perspective, she had already checked and knew we were not there. Both memories could be honest. No missing time is required. That explanation is so simple that it is probably correct. Yet I remember the certainty on both sides. We were not saying, I think we were in there. We knew we had been. She was not saying, maybe I checked. She knew she had. That contradiction is what preserved the memory. If anyone had immediately admitted being confused, we probably would have forgotten the entire thing. Instead, nobody backed down. There are also psychological reasons the prayer itself could affect our memory. Serious conversations feel longer and more isolated than casual ones. When children focus intensely on something emotional, awareness of the surrounding environment can narrow. We may have lost track of time. Someone could have opened the bedroom door without us noticing. If she looked in and saw 3 children sitting silently on the floor, perhaps she somehow failed to process what she saw because she expected the room to be empty. That sounds strange, but inattentional blindness is real. People can overlook obvious things when their attention is directed elsewhere. Maybe she looked only toward the bed or desk. Maybe we were just outside her field of view. The room did not need to disappear. She only needed to fail to notice 3 children for a second. Children are also not always reliable witnesses. Neither were we. We were all young. No one checked a clock. No one wrote down what happened that night. There are no photographs of us sitting in the room. Everything I know now comes from memory. That means I have to leave room for ordinary error. At the same time, the religious context gives the story a different emotional weight. For me, being born again was not just a phrase. It represented the idea that a person could choose faith and become connected to something larger. The girl who prayed that night made that choice sincerely, at least as sincerely as a child could. Years later, after her death, I found myself returning to that moment because it gave me some comfort. Whatever happened later in her life, I remembered her sitting with us and asking to pray. I remembered that she wanted that connection. If there is something after death, I want to believe that moment mattered. That belief is different from claiming the room became invisible. One can hold spiritual meaning without insisting on a supernatural mechanism. Maybe the other girl simply looked at the wrong time. The prayer can still be meaningful. Maybe the room was ordinary. The friendship was not. Maybe there was no miracle. The memory still became a gift after our friend died. That is probably the healthiest way I know to understand it. But I would be lying if I said I never wonder. What if the other girl really did open the door while we were in there? What if she looked directly into a dark, empty bedroom at the same moment the 3 of us were sitting on the floor with the light on? What would that mean? Did time somehow slip? Were we hidden from her? Did she see the room at a different moment? Was there some kind of protective or spiritual boundary around what was happening? Those questions are impossible to answer now. I do not even know whether the other girl from the sleepover remembers the event. It would be interesting to know what she recalls as an adult, but memory after decades is complicated. If she knows our version of the story, her recollection might be influenced by it. If she has forgotten, reminding her might create more confusion rather than clarity. There is no experiment we can perform. The house may not even belong to my family anymore. My brother's bedroom has almost certainly changed. The children involved became adults. One of them never made it beyond 22. Whatever happened exists only in the memories of the people who were there. I think that is why my best friend and I do not talk about it very often. There is nothing to solve. We both remember praying with our friend. We both remember coming out of the room and being told we had not been there. We both remember losing her years later. There is no explanation that changes any of those facts. Talking about it too much might actually make the memory feel less real. It could turn into a ghost story instead of what it was. And what it was, first, was a childhood moment between 3 girls. One of us had questions about faith. 2 of us tried to answer. Then all 3 of us prayed. I sometimes wonder what our friend remembered about that night as she grew older. Did it remain important to her? Did she even remember it? Did her beliefs change? Was it only a childhood memory she eventually forgot? I never asked. When people are alive, we assume there will always be time for strange conversations like that. There will be another chance to ask about an old sleepover. Another chance to laugh about how frightened or confused everyone became. Then, something happens, and that opportunity disappears. If I had known at 16, 18, or 21 that she would die at 22, I would have asked her what she remembered. Did she remember sitting on the floor? Did she remember the prayer? Did she remember everyone being angry afterward? Did she think anything unusual had happened? I will never know. That unanswered question is more haunting to me now than the possibility that the room somehow became invisible. Death leaves ordinary mysteries behind. Not only the great questions about where someone went, but small things you forgot to ask. A story they never finished. A joke whose meaning you no longer remember. A childhood event only they could confirm. Our friend took her version of that night with her. My best friend and I are left with ours. I have wondered whether the later tragedy caused me to remember the sleepover as more supernatural than it felt at the time. That is very possible. When someone dies young, the mind searches their past for meaning. Ordinary moments become symbols. A photograph taken years earlier can suddenly look like a farewell. A sentence becomes a warning. A prayer becomes preparation. We know intellectually that the future did not reach backward and arrange those events, but emotionally it can feel that way. The fact that she was the girl who wanted to be saved makes the coincidence especially powerful. If a different friend had died, perhaps I would not connect the sleepover to anything. Because it was her, the prayer seems significant. Because the room was supposedly empty, the memory seems even more unusual. I have to acknowledge that bias. But even after stripping away the later meaning, there is still a simple childhood mystery. 3 girls say they spent a period of time in a lit bedroom. Another girl says she checked that exact bedroom during the same period and found it dark and empty. Someone's memory or perception was wrong. We just do not know whose. Perhaps that is all it ever was. One person checked 5 minutes too early. 3 children misjudged the timing. Decades later, the contradiction survived while the ordinary details vanished. That explanation does not frighten me. In some ways, it comforts me. It allows the prayer to remain personal without turning it into proof of anything. But there are nights when I remember the story exactly as it felt. The 3 of us sitting close together on the floor, the bedroom light on, our friend deciding she wanted to pray, the quiet afterward, then walking back to the sleepover and being met with anger. Where were you? In my brother's room. No, you weren't. I checked. The room was empty. The lights were off. I can still imagine the 3 of us looking at each other. We knew we had been there. Years passed. We stayed friends. Then one of the girls from that room died at 22, leaving the other 2 of us to carry the memory forward. I do not know whether that night was spiritual, supernatural, or simply the kind of confusing event children experience and adults later give meaning to. I know only that the 3 of us went into that room together. We sat on the floor. We prayed. When we came out, the other girls insisted that for at least part of the time, there had been no one there. Now, decades later, my best friend and I are the only 2 left who can still talk about what happened inside that room. We rarely do. Maybe there is nothing left to say. Maybe the girl who checked the bedroom simply checked at the wrong moment. Maybe the darkness she remembered was only a childhood mistake. I am completely willing to accept that. But whenever I think about our friend who died, I also remember her as a little girl sitting on my brother's floor asking us how to be saved. And I remember that while the 3 of us believed we were sitting there together under a light, Someone outside opened that same room and swore there was nothing inside at all. One October night, close to Halloween, some friends and I decided to go out and visit a place everyone called the Witch House. I do not know how much of the story surrounding the place was actually true. Like a lot of local legends, the name probably did most of the work. Once people start calling an abandoned house the Witch House, every broken window and strange object around it becomes evidence that something terrible happened there. Still, that was what everyone knew it as. The house sat near the edge of a tree line at the far end of a meadow. During the day, the area probably looked ordinary enough, but at night it felt completely isolated. There were no streetlights, no nearby houses that we could easily see, just the open field, the dark woods behind it, and the old property sitting at the edge. Going there in October made everything feel worse. The air was cold. The trees were losing their leaves. Halloween was close enough that we were already in the mood to scare ourselves. If we had gone there in the middle of a bright summer afternoon, maybe we would have laughed at everything we found. At night, we took it much more seriously. We crossed the meadow toward the house. The closer we got, the quieter we became. From a distance, we had mainly been focused on the main building. Once we approached the property, though, we noticed there were several smaller structures between the house and the woods. They looked like old shacks or sheds. They formed almost a line leading away from the main property and toward the tree line. That immediately made the place feel stranger. An abandoned farmhouse with one shed would have been normal. A series of rough structures disappearing toward the woods made it feel as though the property had been built for some purpose we did not understand. We decided to investigate the smaller buildings before going into the main house. The first structure had large metal doors. What bothered me was the way they locked. The locking mechanism was on the outside. That did not automatically mean anything sinister. Plenty of storage sheds lock from the outside. If the structure had been used for tools, animals, or equipment, an exterior latch would be completely normal. But standing there at night, looking at a building with heavy metal doors that could be secured from the outside, my mind went somewhere much darker. One of the doors was slightly open. We pulled it farther and went inside. The interior was dark and smelled old. There were bunk beds inside, not normal bedroom furniture that had simply been abandoned. They were worn down, tattered, and looked as though they had been sitting there for years. That by itself was strange. Why were there bunk beds in a shack behind an abandoned house? Maybe it had once been used as a bunkhouse for farm workers. Maybe children had slept there. Maybe someone had moved old furniture out of the main house and stored it there. There were ordinary explanations. Then we noticed the dolls. They were scattered across the beds. Some were lying down. Others were sitting or leaning against the frames. At first, I thought they were just damaged toys. Then my light passed over one of the faces. It had the face of a pig. Not a cartoon pig, not a cute stuffed animal face, a realistic pig face. I looked at another doll. Same thing. Another pig face. There were several of them. The human-shaped dolls had these disturbingly realistic pig faces attached to them. I remember staring at them and immediately feeling that we should leave. There is something especially unsettling about an object that is almost familiar. A normal doll might be creepy in an abandoned building, but at least you know what it is supposed to be. These looked wrong in a very deliberate way. Someone had either bought them like that or altered them. The pig faces looked too specific to be random damage. I could not tell how old they were. I did not want to touch them. For all I knew, they could have been part of some old Halloween display or art project. Maybe teenagers had come out there before us and decorated the building specifically to frighten anyone who found it. That would actually make a lot of sense. A place known locally as the Witch House would attract exactly the kind of people who wanted to add creepy objects. Someone could have collected broken dolls, modified their faces, and left them in the bunk beds. Years later, another group would discover them and assume they had always been there. At the time, however, we were not thinking that logically. We were thinking about why someone would place pig-faced dolls on old bunk beds inside a shack that locked from the outside. It felt intentional. We did not stay long. We backed out and continued toward the next structure. By then, everyone was more alert. The adventure had started feeling less funny. At the second shack, we could not get the door open. There were pieces missing from the outside walls, though, leaving gaps between the boards. We moved closer and looked through the slats. The room inside seemed mostly empty. There was one wooden chair. It sat by itself. Above it, hanging from the ceiling, was a rope. The rope had been cut. It ended above or near the chair. The image was immediate. A chair beneath a hanging rope. Again, there could have been completely harmless reasons for it. The rope may have once held a light, tool, pulley, or piece of equipment. The chair may have been moved underneath it later. They may not have been connected at all. But standing outside in the dark, after seeing pig-faced dolls in the previous building, our minds made the obvious connection. It looked like someone had prepared a place for a hanging. None of us said that we should turn around, at least not seriously. We were already there. We had crossed the field, entered one building, and looked into the second. The main house was only a little farther ahead. Fear had started mixing with stubbornness. Nobody wanted to be the one who admitted they were too scared to continue. So we kept going. The main house was in worse condition than I had expected. One of the rear windows was broken. The glass around it was damaged enough that someone could crawl through if they were careful. The first room beyond the window was full of trash. There were old pieces of debris scattered across the floor. I could not tell how much belonged to the original occupants and how much had been left by people trespassing over the years. That is one thing about abandoned buildings that gets forgotten in ghost stories. Once a place becomes known as haunted, people start changing it. Teenagers break windows. People spray paint symbols. Someone moves furniture. Others bring strange objects to make the place look worse. Then the next group arrives and believes everything is original. At the time, I did not think much about that. I only saw a dark, abandoned room with a broken window and garbage everywhere. There was a closed door on the far wall. I decided to go inside. I climbed through the broken window. Looking back, the most dangerous thing about the entire night may have been that decision. Abandoned buildings can be structurally unstable. Floors collapse. Nails stick out of boards. Broken glass hides under debris. Animals nest inside. People sometimes use them for drugs or as temporary shelter. There could have been someone living there. None of that crossed my mind strongly enough to stop me. I was focused on the story of the witch house. Once inside, I stood in the first room and used the light from my phone to see. The beam was not very strong. Everything outside the small circle of light remained black. The room looked abandoned. Trash covered parts of the floor. The walls were damaged and dirty. Nothing moved. My friends remained outside or near the window while I approached the closed door. Every step sounded louder inside the empty house. The floor creaked beneath me. I reached the door. I hesitated for a moment. Then I opened it. There was another room on the other side. At first, I saw only darkness. I raised my phone and slowly moved the light across the walls. That was when I saw the red paint. There were symbols everywhere. Dozens of them. Pentagrams, triangles, other shapes I could not immediately identify. They had been painted across the walls in red. The phone light moved from one symbol to another. The farther I turned, the more appeared. The room looked as though someone had covered it deliberately. I had expected graffiti, names, swear words, maybe a badly drawn ghost or some teenager's attempt at a scary message. This felt more organized than that. The symbols repeated. Some were larger than others. They covered enough of the walls that I could not dismiss them as one person making a quick joke. Someone had spent time in there. I do not know whether the symbols meant anything. A pentagram is not automatically proof of anything dangerous or satanic. The symbol appears in many religious and historical contexts, some of them protective rather than harmful. Triangles can mean almost anything. Teenagers trying to create a fake ritual room could easily copy symbols from movies without understanding them. Red paint is also the most obvious color if your goal is to make an abandoned house look frightening. If someone wanted future visitors to think they had found a satanic ritual site, that is exactly what they would paint. But none of those rational thoughts came to me quickly enough. I was standing alone in a dark room in a building everyone called the Witch House. Outside were bunk beds covered in pig-faced dolls. In another shack was a chair beneath a cut rope. Now my phone light was showing me walls covered in red symbols. My fear level went up immediately. I turned around to look back at the door I had just entered through. That was when my light hit the back of it. Painted across the door was an enormous upside-down crucifix. That was enough for me. I had seen the Blair Witch Project. I knew exactly how this kind of story was supposed to end. You ignore the warning signs. You go farther into the building. You find the creepy room. Then you discover something you really did not want to find. I had no interest in continuing to follow that script. All the confidence I had felt outside disappeared. I turned around, went back through the first room, and headed for the broken window. I climbed out as quickly as I could without cutting myself. I told the others I was done. We left. Nobody argued. We crossed back through the property and into the meadow. Once we were away from the house, everyone started talking more. That is usually how fear works in a group. While you are close to whatever is frightening you, nobody says much. Once there is distance, everyone suddenly becomes loud. We started going over everything we had found. The pig-faced dolls, the bunk beds, the rope, the chair, the painted symbols, the upside-down cross. It sounded worse when listed together. Each detail seemed to support the next. The property started feeling like one connected scene, a place where people had been locked inside, a hanging room, a ritual house. Something terrible must have happened there. That was what our imaginations wanted to build. But there were major problems with that conclusion. We had no idea when any of the objects had been placed there. The shacks could have been used for completely ordinary farm purposes decades earlier. The bunk beds may have belonged to workers or children. The dolls could have been left by recent trespassers. The chair and rope may have had nothing to do with each other. The graffiti inside the house was almost certainly created by people after the property became abandoned. The entire witch house legend may have encouraged visitors to decorate the place in exactly that style. In fact, the more I think about it now, the more likely that seems. People knew about the house. We knew about it. That means other groups had been there before us. Some of them probably wanted to make the experience more frightening for the next visitors. A few cans of red paint, some damaged dolls, and a rope could transform an ordinary abandoned property into something that looked like a ritual site. The realistic pig faces remain the strangest part to me. I would love to know what those dolls actually were. Maybe they were commercially produced toys. There are plenty of strange dolls made for collectors, theater, Halloween decorations, or art projects. Someone could have brought them out there specifically for the creepy effect. Maybe they were masks placed over ordinary dolls. In darkness, with only a flashlight, I may have remembered the faces as more realistic than they actually were. Fear changes visual memory. Once I thought pig face, every detail might have become sharper and more disturbing in my mind. The same is true of the rope. I remember it as a cut, hanging rope above a single chair. But I do not remember a noose. I do not remember seeing blood, damage to the ceiling, or anything proving a person had ever been harmed there. It may have been nothing more than an old rope hanging from a beam. The chair happened to be beneath it. Our minds supplied the execution scene. The metal doors on the first shack may have looked as though they were designed to imprison someone, but exterior locks are normal on storage buildings. Bunk beds in an agricultural structure could have housed seasonal workers. The doors would be locked when no one was inside to protect belongings. Years later, the building decayed. The furniture remained, and someone added disturbing dolls. There is no need for a witch or cult to explain it. The symbols inside the main house are probably the easiest part to explain. Abandoned buildings attract graffiti. Buildings believed to be haunted attract occult-looking graffiti. The more famous the local legend becomes, the more likely someone is to paint pentagrams and inverted crosses because they know it will scare the next group. We may have been walking through layers of previous visitors' attempts to keep the legend alive. That possibility is almost funny now. We went there because we had heard about the witch house. Maybe people before us had heard the same story. They went inside, found an ordinary abandoned farmhouse, became disappointed, and decided to improve it. Then we arrived years later, saw their work, and became convinced the legend had evidence behind it. Afterward, maybe we told other people what we had seen. Those people might have gone there expecting pig-faced dolls and satanic symbols. If they added something new, the story would grow again. That is how local legends can build themselves. Still, none of those explanations made me sleep better afterward. For about a week, I had trouble closing my eyes at night. Every time the room became dark, I pictured that house. I saw the broken window, the trash on the floor, the phone light sliding across the red symbols. Then, the giant upside-down cross on the back of the door. I knew logically that nothing had followed us. We never saw a witch. We did not see a ghost. Nobody chased us through the woods. There were no footsteps behind us as we crossed the meadow. Nothing appeared outside my house afterward. The fear came entirely from what we had found and what I imagined it meant. That was enough. The joke I kept making was that if I closed my eyes, I might finally see the witch. It sounds ridiculous, but that was genuinely how I felt. As long as I was awake, I could see my room. I knew I was safe. Closing my eyes meant allowing my mind to return to that property. The pig-faced dolls were usually the first image, then the chair, then the red walls. I sometimes imagined a woman standing just outside the reach of the phone light in that second room. I never saw anyone there. That image came later. Fear filled the dark parts of the memory with things that had not actually happened. That is another reason I am careful about calling the place supernatural. The most frightening parts after the fact were not necessarily things we witnessed. They were things our minds invented once we had enough disturbing material. We never saw a witch. We never heard a voice. No doll moved. No rope swung. No symbol changed. There were no unexplained footsteps or doors closing behind us. Everything we encountered was physical. Buildings, furniture, toys, paint, rope. The horror came from the arrangement. Someone had made choices that created those scenes. Whether those choices were connected or separated by decades, I do not know. That human element may actually be more unsettling than a haunting. If it was all staged, somebody carried realistic pig-faced dolls into an abandoned shack and placed them on old bunk beds. Somebody painted dozens of red symbols across the walls of the main house. Somebody painted an enormous inverted cross on the door. Someone may have placed the chair beneath the rope knowing exactly what it would look like. Maybe it was just teenagers having fun. But they put real effort into making the place disturbing. There is also a darker possibility that had nothing to do with the supernatural. Abandoned properties sometimes become gathering places for people doing things they do not want seen. The shacks could have been used by squatters, vandals, or people involved in illegal activity. The symbols may have had no religious meaning at all. They could have marked a place where a particular group spent time. The dolls might have been part of some disturbing art project or prank. If anyone had been inside while we were exploring, that would have been a much more immediate danger than a ghost. We were fortunate the house seemed empty. I would never recommend doing what I did now. Crawling alone through a broken window into an abandoned rural house at night is dangerous for countless reasons. There could have been broken glass hidden where I placed my hands. The floor could have collapsed. There might have been needles or chemicals in the trash. An animal could have been cornered inside. Someone could have been living there. Even the buildings themselves may have contained asbestos, mold, unstable ceilings, or exposed wiring. At the time, none of that frightened me as much as a painted cross. That shows how young and focused on the legend we were. I have wondered whether the house really had any connection to someone considered a witch. Maybe a woman had lived there who was different, isolated, or disliked by the community. In small towns, that can be enough for rumors to begin. A person practices herbal medicine. Someone keeps to themselves. A tragedy occurs nearby. Years later, they become the witch. Or maybe there was never a specific person at all. The house was old and abandoned at the edge of the woods, so someone invented the name. That is often all a legend needs. Once a location has a title like that, every feature becomes part of the story. The trees are no longer trees. They are the witch's woods. The sheds are no longer storage buildings. They are cages. The dolls become ritual objects. The rope becomes evidence of a death. Graffiti becomes proof of worship. The mind connects everything. We certainly did. By the time we left that night, it felt as though we had walked through a complete sequence of warnings. The first building told us something was wrong. The second told us something terrible had happened. The main house told us to leave. That is how I remember the emotional progression. Looking back with adult reasoning, I can see how easily coincidence and human vandalism could have created the same effect. But knowing that now does not change how it felt to be there. The worst moment was still inside that second room. I remember the phone in my hand, the narrow cone of light, red shapes appearing as I moved it across the walls, one pentagram. Then another. Triangles, more symbols. Every movement of my wrist revealed something new. I had not yet fully decided to run. Part of me was still curious. Then I turned around. The inverted crucifix filled the door. That visual connected every scary story and horror movie in my head at once. I did not need anything to move. I did not need a ghost to appear. My imagination had already completed the scene. There was supposed to be something behind me. I did not check. I left. I think that was probably the smartest thing I did all night. Even if nothing paranormal existed there, we had already pushed our luck. We were trespassing in unstable buildings in the dark. We did not know who owned the property. We did not know whether other people used it. We did not know what was in the woods behind those shacks. Fear finally made us cautious where common sense had failed. We never saw the witch. That is the part I usually joke about when telling the story. We found almost every horror cliche possible except an actual supernatural figure. Pig-faced dolls, a hanging rope, an abandoned house, pentagrams, an inverted cross, a dark forest, Halloween approaching. It was almost too perfect. That is one of the reasons I suspect people had intentionally staged at least some of it. Reality usually does not arrange itself so neatly, but the fact that it may have been staged does not make the memory harmless. Someone had still created those images. Someone had been in those rooms before us. Someone had decided that a row of damaged bunk beds needed dolls with pig faces. That person's intentions remain just as unknown to me as the legend of the witch. I do not know what eventually happened to the property. Maybe it was torn down. Maybe it is still standing. Perhaps another group of teenagers went there the following Halloween and found the same things. Maybe they found objects we never saw. Maybe someone took the dolls home. I hope not. If I ever went back now, I suspect daylight would destroy most of the fear. The shacks would look smaller. The rope would look ordinary. The painted symbols would probably look like amateur graffiti. I might recognize the pig-faced dolls as Halloween decorations. The main house would become nothing more than a decaying building filled with trash. Part of me would like that explanation. Another part of me is glad I never returned to test it. Some places become powerful because of the memory attached to them. Going back could reveal the trick. Or it could show that I remembered everything correctly. I am not sure which would be more unsettling. I still do not believe we encountered anything supernatural that night. We did not have enough evidence for that. Everything we saw could have been placed there by people. The whole property may have been one large, unofficial haunted attraction created slowly by vandals and local legend. That is probably what it was. But there is one thing I cannot remove from the memory. When I climbed through that broken window, I was expecting an abandoned room. I found one. Then I opened a door I probably should have left closed. My phone light moved across walls covered in red symbols until I finally turned back toward the entrance and saw that enormous inverted cross waiting on the door behind me. Nothing followed us when we left. Nothing needed to. For the next week, every time I tried to sleep, I kept imagining that I had missed something standing in the darkness just outside the reach of my phone. We went looking for the witch and never found her. The problem was that after I came home, every time I closed my eyes, part of me expected that was when she would finally find me. I was around 7 or 8 years old when this happened, and the only person who has ever really believed me is my childhood friend, because she was there too. She was a little older than me, probably 10 or 11. We were neighbors and spent a lot of time together, especially during the summer holidays. We lived on the same road, so it was normal for us to sit outside, walk between each other's houses, and spend entire afternoons deciding what game we were going to play next. The road itself already had a strange feeling to it. At the time, I did not think about that much. It was just where I lived. Only when I got older and started looking back at everything that happened there did I realize how many unsettling memories seemed connected to that one area. There was also an abandoned chapel not far from my house with graves around it, which did not exactly help the atmosphere. But this particular experience involved a car. One morning, an old car simply appeared on our road. I do not remember hearing it arrive. I do not remember seeing anyone park it. There was no obvious owner coming and going from it. One day, the space was empty, and then suddenly this old vehicle was sitting there as though it had always been part of the street. It was dark blue, although the color was difficult to see because the car was in terrible condition. There was rust all over it. The body looked dirty and neglected. Dead insects were stuck to parts of the exterior and windows. It looked less like someone's daily vehicle and more like a car that had been abandoned somewhere for years and then somehow moved onto our road. That alone made it interesting to us. Children notice anything different in a familiar place. A strange vehicle appearing outside becomes something to talk about. We wondered who owned it. Maybe someone nearby had bought it. Maybe it had broken down and been left there temporarily. Maybe someone was visiting. We did not know. The oddest thing about the car was the back seat. As far as I could tell, the vehicle was completely empty except for 2 children's seats. There was a pink child's car seat and a pink booster seat in the back. That detail bothered me even before anything truly strange happened. The car looked old, dirty, and almost abandoned, but someone had left children's seats inside. It created the impression that children were supposed to be riding in it. Yet I never saw any. I never saw an adult get into the driver's seat either. The vehicle just remained parked there. I cannot say with certainty how long it stayed. In my memory, it was there for at least several days, possibly a couple of weeks. Childhood time can stretch, though. Something that happened over 4 or 5 days can later feel as if it lasted much longer. Still, I remember becoming used to seeing the car. It became another object on the road. Then, one evening, shortly after the summer holidays had started, my friend and I were outside together. We were sitting on the low wall outside her house. I think we were talking about what we were going to do the next day. It was one of those normal childhood conversations where the future meant tomorrow morning, another game, another walk, another afternoon outside. I was speaking. Then, I looked toward the old blue car. What happened next is partly my memory and partly something my friend told me years later. According to her, I stopped talking in the middle of a sentence. I did not finish what I was saying. I simply became quiet and stared at the vehicle. There were people inside it. That is what I thought at first. 3 people. I could see them clearly enough that I remembered details about their faces and hair, even now. There was a woman. She had brown hair and appeared to be somewhere in her 20s or 30s. She looked terrified. Not frightened in the way someone might look after hearing a sudden noise. She looked physically sick with fear. Her face had the expression of someone who was about to faint or throw up. She seemed overwhelmed. There was also a blonde-haired girl. She had blue eyes and looked around 7 to 10 years old. Then there was another girl. She had brown hair. She was sitting in the pink child's car seat. I cannot remember exactly how old she looked, but maybe 6 or 7. It was her eyes that made the whole scene feel wrong. They were yellow, not light brown, not hazel, reflecting sunlight. Yellow. Bright yellow, almost like a cat's eyes. They seemed to shine. The girl was looking directly at me. The moment I noticed her stare, I felt one of the worst sensations I can remember from childhood. It was not only fear, it was the certainty that something about those people was wrong. I cannot explain why I thought they were not human. The woman looked human. The blonde girl looked human. Even the brown-haired girl looked mostly human except for her eyes. But I remember immediately feeling that whatever was sitting inside that car was not a normal family. The brown-haired girl never looked away. Her eyes stayed fixed on me. There was something deliberate in the way she watched. She did not look curious. She did not smile. She did not behave like a child who had noticed another kid outside. She simply stared. My friend noticed that I had stopped speaking. She followed my line of sight toward the car. She saw people too. That is the part that has always kept me from completely dismissing the experience. I did not tell her what I was seeing first. I did not say, "There are people in the car." I just stopped talking and stared. She looked because she wanted to know what had caught my attention. Years later, when we discussed the experience again, her description was similar to mine, but not identical. She remembered a brown-haired woman, too. But to her, the woman looked much older, somewhere around 40 or 50. She also saw the brown-haired girl, but she remembered that girl having green eyes rather than yellow. She did not remember seeing the blonde-haired child at all. Those differences are important. If we had described every detail exactly the same after so many years, I might worry that we had simply influenced each other's memory through repeated retelling. Instead, there were overlaps and disagreements. We both remembered a woman. We both remembered a brown-haired girl. We both remembered the car suddenly being occupied when it had appeared empty before. But our perception of their ages, eye color, and the number of people was not identical. That could suggest we were looking at something real under poor visual conditions and interpreting details differently. It could also mean our memories changed in different directions over time. At the time, though, we did not compare all of those details. I remember looking at my friend. She looked at me. Then she asked something like, "Did you see the people in the car?" I said yes. We both looked back. The car was empty. There was no gradual movement. We did not see anyone open the doors. No one climbed out. No one ducked down. They were simply gone. One moment there had been people sitting inside. The next moment there was only the empty vehicle with the two pink child seats in the back. That terrified me. If the people had stepped out, I could have accepted that we had simply missed their arrival. If the car had driven away, there would have been an obvious ending. Instead, the vehicle remained exactly where it had been. Only the occupants disappeared. I did not want to investigate. I did not walk toward the car. I did not look through the windows more closely. I told my friend I was going home. Then, I left. I did not tell anyone what happened that evening. I went inside and eventually went to bed. I think part of me was afraid that speaking about it would make it more real. Another part probably assumed adults would laugh. I also did not fully understand what I had seen. At 7 or 8 years old, I did not have a theory. I only knew that there had been people in a car who gave me a terrible feeling. And then, they had vanished. The next day, my friend and I went outside again. The old blue car was gone. There was nothing parked in the place where it had been. That frightened me even more. Until then, the car itself had been proof that at least part of the experience was real. Even if the people had been a mistake, the vehicle existed. Now, it had vanished too. Of course, cars move. That is what they are designed to do. Someone could easily have collected it early that morning. The owner may have returned during the night. A tow truck might have removed it. There is nothing supernatural about a parked car being gone the next day. But because we had never seen anyone associated with it, the disappearance felt strange. Later, I asked my mother where the car had gone. She looked confused. "What car?" I described it. "The old dark blue one, covered in rust, the one that had been sitting on the road." She told me there had been no car like that. She suggested I had imagined it. That reaction bothered me because my mother noticed things like vehicles parked near our house. In fact, there had been another situation where a neighbor parked a campervan in front of our property, and my mother became extremely annoyed because she said it blocked the sunlight. She absolutely paid attention to what was parked outside. A filthy old vehicle sitting nearby for days should have been exactly the kind of thing she noticed. Yet she insisted she had never seen it. That does not necessarily mean the car was supernatural. Children can overestimate how much adults notice. Maybe the vehicle was parked farther down the road than I remember. Perhaps my mother usually approached the house from another direction and simply did not pay attention to it. If it was only there for a few days rather than weeks, she could easily have missed it. She may also have forgotten it by the time I asked. Adults have more important things to remember than a stranger's old car. To me, the vehicle had become the center of a frightening experience. To her, it might have been background scenery she never consciously registered. Still, her denial made me question myself. Had there really been a car? Had I dreamed the entire thing? The problem was my friend. She remembered it too. Neither of us talked about the incident for years. I had nightmares about it sometimes, but I kept them to myself. The image that returned most often was the brown-haired girl staring at me. Sometimes I remembered the yellow eyes more brightly than they probably appeared in reality. They became almost luminous in dreams. I would see her sitting in the child seat inside that dark, dirty car, watching from behind the glass. The woman beside her always looked frightened. That was another detail I could never make sense of. If the brown-haired girl was the thing that scared me, why did the adult woman seem frightened too? Was she afraid of the child? Was she afraid of something else in the car? Was she trying to warn us? Or was her expression simply something my childhood mind created? Years later, I finally brought up the incident with my old friend. I did not know whether she would remember. Part of me expected her to tell me it had been some weird dream I had turned into a memory. Instead, she remembered. She said she had spent years assuming it was a dream too, but she remembered it vividly enough that when we started comparing details, we both recognized the same event. The car, the people, the disappearance, the strange child. That conversation disturbed me almost as much as the original experience. If I had been the only person who remembered it, I could blame a childhood dream. Children sometimes dream about familiar streets, and later confuse the dream with reality. A vivid nightmare can use the exact layout of your neighborhood, your friend's house, and objects you saw during the day. Years later, the memory of waking may disappear while the dream remains. I might genuinely believe something happened outside, even if I experienced it while asleep. But if my friend independently remembered the same strange car and some of the same people, a shared dream becomes much harder to explain. Not impossible in the broader sense that our memories may have influenced each other later, but harder. One reasonable explanation is that the people were actually in the car. Maybe the vehicle belonged to someone visiting a neighbor. The woman and children got inside while we were not paying attention. Because of reflections on the windows, we could not see them properly. The brown-haired girl's eyes may have reflected the evening light, producing a yellow or green shine. The woman may have looked ill or worried because she was tired, sick, upset, or simply caught in an unflattering expression. The blonde child may have been visible only from my viewing angle, which would explain why my friend did not see her. Then, when we looked at each other for a second, the occupants ducked down or exited through the opposite side of the vehicle. That seems possible, but disappearing that quickly would be difficult. We looked away only briefly. For three people to open doors, get out, and move somewhere we could not see should have produced sound and movement, unless they were never there in the first place. Reflections may have created the entire scene. Car windows are extremely good at producing false images, especially in changing evening light. Reflections of people standing behind us could appear inside the car. Trees, houses, clouds, and bright objects can combine into face-like patterns. The dark interior gives the reflection depth, making it look as if someone is sitting behind the glass. My friend and I were standing close together, so we would see roughly the same reflected shapes. But our angles were slightly different, which might explain why she saw two figures while I saw three. It could also explain why we disagreed about age and eye color. A reflection from green vegetation could make eyes appear green. Sunlight, or a warm-colored object, could make them appear yellow. Then, when we turned our heads and looked back, the angle changed enough for the reflections to vanish. That is probably one of the strongest natural explanations. The brown-haired girl's glowing eyes could have been a reflection from the glass. Animals' eyes can shine because of a reflective layer inside the eye, but human eyes do not normally glow like cat's eyes. If what I remember was truly bright yellow light coming from a human-looking child's eyes, then I almost certainly misinterpreted some reflection. The glass itself may have caught points of sunlight near where her eyes appeared. My mind then attached those lights to a face. At 7 or 8 years old, I would not have understood the optics. I would only see a girl with impossible eyes. The adult woman's frightened expression may also have come from distorted reflections. A face viewed through dirty glass can look stretched, pale, or worried. Rust, dead insects, scratches, and grime on the windows might have interfered with our view. The car's condition could have made ordinary occupants look much stranger. Maybe there really were people inside. The visual distortions made them appear inhuman. There is also the possibility that the vehicle was being used by travelers or a family in difficult circumstances. The woman might have been genuinely distressed. If there were children in the back, maybe something serious was happening. Perhaps the car had broken down. Maybe they were waiting for someone. Maybe there had been an argument. As children watching from a distance, we could have misunderstood an ordinary but tense family situation. The fact that the woman looked as though she might faint or vomit could indicate illness. If the child in the back seat had unusual contact lenses, an eye condition, or simply caught a reflection, that could explain the strange gaze. But I never saw anyone enter or leave the car, and my mother claimed she never saw the vehicle at all. Another possibility is that the car was connected to someone working nearby and was moved before my mother noticed it. Old cars can look abandoned even when they are used. Someone may have parked it because their usual driveway was full. The child seats could have been old seats left permanently inside. The exterior condition only made us assume it had no active owner. Our belief that it had appeared may simply mean we did not notice it arriving. Children do not monitor a street constantly. A person could park a car at midnight and leave. The next morning, it feels as though the vehicle materialized. Then they collect it later, and it disappears just as mysteriously. That part requires no paranormal explanation at all. The figures are more difficult because my friend confirms them. But shared perception errors happen. If I suddenly stopped talking and stared at the car, my friend would immediately become alert, even without me saying anything. My body language told her I had seen something important. She looked toward the car, expecting to find the reason. In low light, expectation can strongly shape what a person sees. Maybe I saw a reflection that looked like people. My friend saw the same vague shapes and interpreted them as people because my fear told her that was what mattered. Then, when we later talked, our memories moved closer together. She may not have originally seen a clear brown-haired girl at all. Years of remembering could sharpen the image. The reverse could also be true. Maybe she noticed the people first without saying anything, and my reaction only seemed first in her memory. Neither of us was taking notes. We were children. Decades of time can alter details. The fact that she remembers green eyes while I remember yellow eyes is a good reminder that memory is not a recording. The woman's age is another example. I saw someone in her 20s or 30s. My friend remembers a woman around 40 or 50. That is a huge difference. If we had been looking at a perfectly clear person in daylight, we should probably agree more closely. The disagreement suggests the image was vague. Maybe the entire face was less visible than I now remember. We supplied age based on hair, posture, and expression. The blonde girl being absent from my friend's memory is even more significant. I remember 3 figures. She remembers 2. That could mean one of us added or missed a person. There might have been an object behind the seat that I interpreted as a blonde child. A pale headrest, doll, bag, or reflection could have created the shape. The pink booster seat may have encouraged my brain to expect another child. If there were 2 child seats, my mind may have created 2 children to occupy them. That would be an understandable perception error. The more I examine it rationally, the more ways there are to explain individual details. Yet the emotional memory remains much stronger than the explanations. I still remember the moment when I realized the brown-haired girl was looking directly at me. The car had felt abandoned before. Suddenly it felt occupied. Not only occupied, but aware. I had the sense that the girl had been waiting for me to notice. That may be pure childhood imagination. A fixed stare often feels intentional even when someone is simply looking outward. A child inside a strange car might stare at another child because they are curious. There is nothing paranormal about that. But the expression and the eyes made it feel predatory. I had no desire to go closer. That instinct may have been important regardless of what we saw. If there really were unknown adults in an unfamiliar vehicle, keeping our distance was the safest thing to do. We were young children outside without an adult beside us. A strange car containing people we did not know was reason enough to go home. It did not need to contain anything supernatural to be potentially unsafe. I am glad we did not approach the doors or knock on the window. We did not try to see whether the car was unlocked. We did not investigate the child seats. We simply left. The abandoned chapel nearby became more important to me only later. At the time, it was another old place on the road. There were graves around it. Like any abandoned religious building, it attracted stories. People naturally connect old graves and strange events. If something unexplained happens nearby, the chapel becomes the obvious source. Maybe someone died there. Maybe the road is haunted. Maybe the people in the car were spirits. Those are easy stories to build after the fact. I do not have evidence connecting the vehicle to the chapel. The car did not appear beside a grave. No one inside wore old-fashioned clothing as far as I remember. Nothing pointed directly toward death or the chapel. The connection exists mostly because multiple strange things happened in the same area. Still, the road did seem to produce more unsettling experiences than other places I lived. Both my house and my friend's house had incidents we later considered paranormal. That history makes the car feel like part of a larger pattern. But it can also create confirmation bias. Once you believe a road is strange, you remember every unexplained event that happened there and forget all the ordinary years. An unusual car becomes haunted. A shadow becomes a person. A nightmare becomes evidence. The more stories accumulate, the stronger the reputation becomes. That does not mean the events were false. It only means the interpretation can grow around them. I try to keep that in mind. The most disturbing question for me has always been whether my mother truly never saw the car. If the vehicle sat on the road as long as I remember, I would expect her to notice. She was observant enough to become upset about a neighbor's campervan. A filthy, dark blue car covered in rust and dead bugs should have caught her attention. Unless it was not there as long as I think. Maybe it arrived that afternoon and disappeared the following morning. My memory may have expanded a day into weeks because the car became important. Childhood memories often compress and stretch time. I remember summer holidays as enormous periods, even though each one lasted only a few months. A strange object seen on 3 different days can feel as though it existed there for weeks. My friend might remember the same because we later discussed it. If the car was only present briefly, my mother missing it becomes much easier to explain. Another possibility is that she was trying not to frighten me. Maybe she had seen the car and did not want to encourage my story about disappearing people. Saying there was no car would shut the conversation down more effectively than admitting she had also noticed it. Parents sometimes minimize frightening things because they want children to feel safe. But I have no reason to think she lied. Her confusion seemed genuine. Perhaps she truly never noticed it. I still have occasional dreams about the people. The details change in dreams, but the brown-haired girl remains the strongest image. Sometimes she is still sitting in the pink car seat. Sometimes she is older. Sometimes her eyes are yellow, sometimes green. That shifting color mirrors the difference between my memory and my friends. The dreams do not prove anything. They show only that the event affected me. An experience can be completely natural and still create nightmares. In fact, uncertainty often makes a memory harder to let go of. If I knew exactly what happened, the story would have an ending. Suppose we discovered the car belonged to an elderly neighbor's relatives. The woman had been sick. The girl wore reflective glasses. They drove away the next morning. That would be it. Instead, I have no owner, no license plate, no name, no explanation. The car existed in my memory, contained people for a few seconds, became empty, and disappeared by the next day. That lack of closure is what makes it feel unreal. I sometimes imagine finding an old photograph of the road from that summer. If the car appeared in the background, at least I would know with certainty that the vehicle itself existed. If it did not, that would not necessarily prove anything, because the photograph could have been taken on another day. There is almost no evidence that would settle it now. The road has probably changed. The neighbors may have moved. The old car, if it was real, is almost certainly gone. The people inside would now be decades older. The brown-haired girl I remember as 6 or 7 would be an adult. That thought is strangely disturbing. If she was a normal child, she might have no idea that 2 kids sitting on a wall once thought she was something inhuman. Maybe she was frightened too. Maybe she had been staring at us because she wanted help. That interpretation changes the entire memory. The woman's sick, terrified expression becomes more important. What if something was wrong inside that vehicle, and we misunderstood who was dangerous? Perhaps the brown-haired girl had unusual-looking eyes because of the lighting. But the adult woman was afraid of the driver, someone outside our view, or a situation we could not understand. Maybe there was a third adult hidden in the front. We never saw enough. What I interpreted as evil might have been another child staring because she was frightened. I will never know. It is also possible that there were mannequins or dolls inside. A broken-down car could have been used to store old objects. Human-shaped dolls in the seats might look disturbingly real through dirty glass. The pink child seats would make that even stranger. Maybe the woman was not moving because she was not a woman at all. But both my friend and I remember expressions and eyes, not static objects. Still, from a distance, people can assign life to mannequins surprisingly easily. The car's dirty windows would hide details and create exactly the uncertainty needed. The sudden disappearance could simply result from changing light when we looked away and back. A reflection that looked like a face would vanish when the sun moved behind a cloud or we changed position. That might explain why there was no movement. Nothing actually left. The image disappeared. The road may also have had lights or reflective surfaces we did not understand. Car windows can layer several views at once: the dark interior, the reflected sky, the road behind the observer, trees, houses, and people nearby. Our brains combine those layers into a coherent scene. Usually, we interpret them correctly. Sometimes, we do not. Two children staring into an extremely dirty old vehicle near sunset could create a perfect situation for visual confusion. That is the explanation I lean toward when trying to be rational, but it does not completely recreate what I remember feeling. The figures seemed three-dimensional. They occupied different seats. The child looked straight at me. The woman looked sick. The blonde girl had blue eyes. Those details feel too specific for reflections. Then I remind myself that dreams also feel specific. Memory also creates detail. What I remember now may be the finished version my mind constructed over years, not the raw image from that evening. My friend's differences support that possibility. We both preserve the central mystery while filling in different details. There may have been something genuinely odd in the car, but our minds interpreted it separately. I no longer insist that the figures were not human. At 7 or 8, I felt that certainty. As an adult, I cannot justify it. I can say they looked wrong. I can say the brown-haired girl's eyes did not look normal to me. I can say both my friend and I believed we saw people who disappeared when we looked back. Anything beyond that is interpretation. Maybe there were people. Maybe there were reflections. Maybe we shared a moment of childhood fear that grew more vivid with time. Maybe the car stayed only one night, and my mother never saw it. All of that is possible. But there is one thing that continues to bother both of us. Neither of us remembers deciding that the car was frightening before the figures appeared. It had been strange, dirty, and interesting, but it was still just an old vehicle. We were sitting on the wall, talking about summer. I was in the middle of a sentence. Then, I looked toward it and stopped speaking. My friend noticed. She looked too. Neither of us told the other what to see. A few seconds later, we were both looking at each other because somehow the empty car now had people sitting inside it. We looked back. They were gone. And by the following day, so was the car. Maybe the whole thing has a simple explanation buried somewhere beneath childhood memory, dirty glass, changing light, and coincidence. I hope it does. Because the alternative is the image that stayed with me through years of nightmares. An old rusted car appearing on our road with two empty pink child seats. Then one evening suddenly containing a frightened woman and children who had not been there before. And among them, a brown-haired girl sitting in the car seat, staring directly at me with eyes that seemed to shine. The part I remember most clearly is not that she disappeared. It is that before she did, she looked at me as though she already knew I was going to remember her.
Quick pause, then we're right back. A lot of people watch one story and leave, but some stick around. They hit subscribe and come back every night. If you want to be one of them, the button's right there. Turn on the bell too, so you never miss a new one. That's it. Let's get back to the story.
When I was about 7 years old, my family was living in an old house in rural France that had been in the family for a long time. The house had been built around 1860. As a child, I did not think much about the age of it. It was simply home. Old walls, old floors, a cellar, a garden, a well, and all the normal little sounds that come with a building that has been standing for more than a century. During the day, None of it seemed especially frightening. At night, however, the house had a different feeling. Old houses are rarely silent. Wood shifts as the temperature changes. Pipes make noises. Wind moves around imperfect windows and doors. Animals can get inside walls or beneath roofs. If you wake suddenly in darkness, it can be difficult to tell whether a sound came from inside the house or somewhere outside. I was young enough that I accepted most of those noises without needing an explanation. The frightening experience did not actually happen to me. It happened to my father. One night, he had a nightmare so bad that everyone in the house woke up because of his scream. I remember the sound more than the details of the dream. It was not the kind of small shout someone makes while dreaming. He screamed loudly enough to wake the entire family. When he finally calmed down, he explained that he had dreamed about a shadowy figure. In the nightmare, this figure was possessing him. I do not know exactly what he meant by that or what he experienced inside the dream. I was only 7, and adults do not always explain frightening things in detail to children. What I understood was that the dream had felt completely real to him. He was terrified. The fear did not disappear when morning came. That was what made the situation unusual. Most nightmares become less powerful after a person wakes, turns on a light, and realizes they are safe. My father could not shake this one. For days afterward, he had trouble sleeping. Then the days became weeks. I think the problem continued for around a month. He would go to bed and become anxious. He was afraid of falling asleep and returning to the same nightmare. Even when he did sleep, he did not seem rested. The whole experience had affected him much more deeply than anyone expected. Sleeping pills eventually helped. They allowed him to get some rest, but they did not remove the feeling that something was wrong. He still felt uncomfortable in the house. It was not simply that he feared another nightmare. He seemed to believe there was something about the house itself that was disturbing him. My family did not have any clear explanation. Stress can cause nightmares. Sleep deprivation can make them worse. Once someone becomes afraid of sleeping, that fear can create a cycle. You lie down expecting something terrible to happen. Because you are anxious, you sleep lightly. You wake often. Your dreams become more vivid. The next night, you are even more afraid. That could easily explain what happened to my father, but he was desperate enough to look for another answer. Eventually, he contacted a dowser. I know how that sounds. Dowsing is one of those subjects that immediately divides people. Some believe dowsers can locate underground water, minerals, or other unseen things by using rods or similar tools. Others believe it is entirely based on unconscious movement, suggestion, and coincidence. My relatives generally belong to the second group. To them, hiring a dowser because of a nightmare sounded ridiculous. But my father was not sleeping properly and wanted to try something. So the man came to our property. I remember watching him walk around outside. He moved through the garden. He inspected the area around our well. He spent time looking at different parts of the property as though he were mapping something beneath the ground. I do not remember exactly what tools he used. My childhood memory mostly preserves the impression of an adult stranger moving around our home and taking the whole situation very seriously. Eventually, he entered the house. Then, he went down into the cellar. The cellar already felt different from the rest of the building. That is not unusual in an old farmhouse. Cellars are dark, cool, damp, and separated from normal family activity. Stone walls hold moisture. The air smells different. Sound behaves strangely. To a 7-year-old, a cellar can feel frightening even when nothing unusual has ever happened there. The dowser spent some time downstairs. When he finished his investigation, he spoke with my father. At first, his explanation sounded almost ordinary. He said there was water flowing beneath the house. According to him, the direction of that underground water might be disturbing my father's sleep. He suggested changing the direction of the bed so that it aligned differently with the flow. I did not understand any of that at the time. Even now, I do not know of a reliable scientific reason why the direction of underground water beneath a house would cause possession nightmares. There may be environmental factors connected to groundwater that can affect a building. Moisture can increase mold. Moving water can create low vibrations. Old foundations can carry sounds from pipes, wells, or natural underground movement. But that is very different from saying a person's bed must be aligned with the direction of water to sleep properly. Still, my father listened. The dowser remained calm while discussing the water. Then, his attitude changed. That is the part I remember most clearly. His tone became serious. He told my father there was something else he needed to know. According to the dowser, someone else was present in the house at that exact moment. Not another family member. Not a visitor. He meant some kind of unseen presence. He told my father that because he was the owner of the house, he needed to go down into the cellar. He needed to open the cellar door and directly demand that this person leave. The change in the atmosphere was immediate. Until then, the visit had been strange but almost practical. The man had walked around, talked about underground water, and suggested moving a bed. Now he was telling my father there was someone invisible inside our home. I remember seeing my father become tense. He took the warning seriously. The dowser and my father went to the cellar together. I do not remember following them closely enough to hear every word. I only remember knowing what they were about to do. My father was supposed to open the door and tell whatever was there to leave the property. He did it. Nothing dramatic happened. There was no scream from the cellar. No door slammed. No shadow rushed upstairs. No objects moved. They simply completed the strange little confrontation and came back. Then, something happened that convinced my father more than anything else could have. That night, he slept properly. For the first time in weeks, he had a good night. No terrifying possession dream, no waking in panic, no long hours lying awake. He simply slept. And from his point of view, that settled the matter. The dowser had arrived. He had identified underground water. He had said there was another presence in the house. My father had ordered it to leave. Then the sleep problem stopped. To him, the sequence was too direct to ignore. Most of our relatives disagreed. They thought the entire thing had an ordinary explanation. The nightmare frightened my father. The fear caused insomnia. The sleeping pills helped break the cycle. Then, the dowser gave him a ritual that made him feel safe again. Once my father believed the problem had been removed, he finally relaxed enough to sleep. That explanation makes a lot of sense. The human brain responds strongly to expectation. If a person believes a room is dangerous, the body can remain tense even when there is no objective threat. Heart rate increases. Small noises become more noticeable. Sleep becomes harder. If the same person later becomes convinced that the danger has been removed, the body may finally calm down. The ritual does not need to have supernatural power. It only needs to change the person's belief. My father may have slept because he expected to sleep. In that sense, the dowser's visit could have worked without the dowser being correct about any invisible presence. There is also the possibility that the timing was coincidence. My father had already been struggling for weeks. The problem could have been reaching its natural end. Perhaps his nervous system was finally recovering from the original nightmare. Maybe the sleeping medication had begun stabilizing his sleep. The first good night happened after the dowser's visit because eventually one good night had to happen. The human mind naturally connects events that occur close together. The dowser says the presence is gone. That night, sleep returns. Those two things become cause and effect, even if they were unrelated. My father never accepted that explanation completely. To this day, he believes the man knew what he was talking about. Part of what convinced him was probably the dowser's sudden change in tone. The man had been discussing water casually. Then, without being prompted, he became serious and warned about another presence. To my father, that made it feel less like someone telling him what he wanted to hear. The dowser could have stayed with the water explanation. Instead, he introduced something more disturbing. Of course, a skeptic could interpret the same behavior differently. A person claiming unusual sensitivity may deliberately make a dramatic statement because it creates a strong emotional impression. Old houses are perfect settings for claims about unseen presences. If the owner has already explained that he is having frightening nightmares, suggesting that something else is in the building is not a completely random guess. It fits the situation. The advice to confront it also creates a powerful psychological ending. Instead of remaining passive and frightened, my father became active. He went into the part of the house associated with the problem and asserted control. He was no longer the victim of the shadow from his nightmare. He became the owner of the house, telling an intruder to leave. Psychologically, that could be extremely effective. The original nightmare involved possession. Something was taking control of him. The cellar ritual reversed that. He was the one giving the command. He had authority. Leave, whether anyone invisible heard him or not, my father heard himself say it. That may have been enough. As an adult, I find that explanation compelling. At 7 years old, though, the whole thing felt much simpler. My father had been attacked in a dream by a shadow. A strange man came to our house. The strange man went into the cellar and said someone else was there. My father ordered that person out. Then he stopped having nightmares. To a child, the conclusion almost writes itself. There had been something in the house. Now it was gone. The age of the farmhouse made the idea easier to believe. A building from 1860 had existed through generations of people. Families had lived there, aged there, become sick there, and probably died nearby. There would have been births, arguments, celebrations, funerals, and countless ordinary events inside those walls. A child can easily imagine that some part of a former resident remained. The cellar especially seemed like the sort of place where something old might hide. But old does not mean haunted. That is another important point. Old buildings accumulate stories because they have simply existed longer. They also produce more strange noises. Floors become uneven. Doors move because frames shift. Chimneys create drafts. Rodents find their way into walls. Electrical systems are sometimes outdated. Moisture causes smells and sounds. A modern house might create the same sensation less often because everything is newer and better sealed. Our farmhouse's age created atmosphere, but atmosphere is not evidence. The underground water is also interesting for reasons unrelated to dowsing. We had a well, so groundwater near the property was obviously real. The dowser did not need supernatural abilities to suspect water beneath a rural farmhouse with a well. He may have understood the local terrain. He could have noticed slope, vegetation, soil moisture, or the placement of the existing well. From those clues, he might reasonably infer how groundwater moved. That would make his first conclusion less mysterious. The claim about the unseen person is harder to evaluate because it cannot be tested afterward. No one saw someone leave. There was no physical evidence. The only result was my father sleeping better. That result mattered emotionally, but it does not tell us what caused it. I have wondered whether my father had experienced sleep paralysis. The description of a shadowy figure possessing him fits some experiences people report while partly awake. Sleep paralysis can involve the sensation of a threatening presence, pressure on the body, inability to move, or a feeling that something is entering or controlling you. The person may believe they were completely awake, even though parts of the experience came from dreaming. If the episode was unusually intense, it could easily frighten someone for weeks. I do not know whether my father was paralyzed during the nightmare. He described it as a dream, so I cannot add details that he never gave. But some sleep-related event may have been involved. Stress could also have contributed. Adults often carry worries children know nothing about. Money, work, family responsibilities, health, an old farmhouse that needs constant maintenance. Any of those could affect sleep. My father may have reached a point of exhaustion, had one terrifying dream, and then developed anxiety around sleep. The dowser arrived at exactly the moment he needed permission to stop being afraid. That does not make my father foolish. Fear does not respond only to logic. If telling an unseen presence to leave allowed him to sleep, then something real changed in him, even if nothing supernatural changed in the house. Still, I cannot completely dismiss the way the event unfolded. The dowser spent time in the cellar before making his warning. I remember him being casual beforehand. Then he became serious. My father did exactly what he was told. The improvement was immediate. Not a week later. Not gradually over another month. That night. Those are the details that kept the story alive in our family. If my father had continued struggling afterward, everyone would have forgotten the dowser. If the man had only talked about underground water, the visit would probably have become a funny family story. Instead, he said there was someone else in the house. My father confronted it, and the problem stopped. Even the skeptics in the family could not change that sequence. They could only explain it differently. And maybe that is what makes the story interesting. Two people can accept every factual detail and still reach opposite conclusions. My father had a terrifying nightmare. True, he struggled to sleep afterward. True, a dowser visited. True, the man claimed there was a presence. True, my father ordered it to leave. True, he slept well that night. True, none of those points requires agreement about why. To my father, something had been in our farmhouse. To other relatives, he had been caught in an anxiety cycle, and the dowser gave him a psychologically effective way to end it. I grew up somewhere between those explanations. I was too young to understand the skepticism at the time. What I remember is my father's fear. Adults usually represent safety when you are 7. Your father is supposed to know what noises mean. He is supposed to check the dark room. If something scares you, you go to him. Seeing him frightened changed the feeling of the house. If my father was afraid, then whatever had happened must have been serious. The memory of him becoming tense when the dowser mentioned another presence has stayed with me. He did not laugh. He did not roll his eyes. He looked like someone had confirmed a suspicion he had been trying not to say aloud. Maybe that was because he already believed something was wrong. The dowser's words matched the fear created by his nightmare. Or maybe, as my father still believes, the man had noticed something the rest of us could not. I do not remember other major paranormal events happening afterward. There was no long series of apparitions, no doors opening by themselves, no voices in the cellar. The house returned to being an old rural farmhouse. That absence of continued activity supports the ordinary explanation. If a presence had genuinely been driven out, of course, it would also fit the paranormal explanation. That is the problem with stories like this. Almost any outcome can be made to fit a belief after the fact. If nothing happens again, believers say it left. If strange things continue, they say it refused. There is no easy way to test it. What can be tested is the effect on my father. He was better. Whatever caused that improvement, it mattered. Years later, relatives still tease or challenge him about the story. They point out that dowsing does not have good evidence behind it. They say the man was taking advantage of someone who was frightened and sleep deprived. They suggest changing the bed direction and ordering a ghost out was essentially a placebo. My father still disagrees. For him, the experience was too personal. He knows how frightened he had been before the visit. He knows how different he felt afterward. When someone has lived through that change directly, scientific arguments about coincidence may not feel as convincing as the memory of finally closing your eyes and sleeping. I do not think the story proves dowsing works. I also do not think it proves our farmhouse contained a spirit. There is not enough evidence for either claim. What happened can be understood without anything supernatural. A nightmare caused insomnia. Anxiety maintained it. Medication helped. A ritual gave my father a feeling of control. His fear decreased. Sleep returned. That is a coherent explanation. But I also understand why my father sees it differently. He had spent weeks feeling as if something was wrong in that house. Then a stranger walked through the property, went into the cellar, came back upstairs, and without being asked, told him that someone else was present. The stranger told him exactly what to do. My father did it. The problem stopped. That is the kind of coincidence that becomes very difficult to dismiss when you are the person living through it. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if the dowser had never mentioned a presence. Would changing the bed alone have worked? Would my father still have slept well that night? Would the insomnia have continued for another month? There is no way to know. Maybe the command in the cellar was the key because it helped him psychologically confront the fear. Maybe simply believing an expert had found the source was enough. Or maybe nothing would have changed until my father addressed whatever he believed had been watching him. I also wonder why the cellar mattered. Was it simply the oldest, darkest part of the house, and therefore the most believable place for an unseen presence? Did the dowser sense something specific there? Was the flowing water closer beneath that part of the building? Could dampness, mold, low-frequency vibration, or some environmental condition have affected how people felt in the house? There are real cases where environmental factors cause headaches, anxiety, sleep disruption, or feelings of unease. Carbon monoxide is an obvious example, though I have no evidence that it was present in our house. Low-frequency sounds can also make spaces feel uncomfortable without people consciously hearing the source. An old rural building could contain countless unnoticed environmental factors. But if that were the cause, why did simply telling someone to leave fix the problem immediately? Again, expectation may be the answer. Our minds and bodies are not separate systems. Belief can affect sleep profoundly. The ritual may have worked because my father trusted it. That does not make his experience imaginary. He really had been afraid. He really had been unable to sleep. He really did improve. The argument is only about the mechanism. As a child, I did not care about mechanisms. I remember the story almost like a sequence from a film. My father screams in the night. The entire house wakes. For weeks, he cannot sleep normally. A dowser arrives. He walks through the garden. He checks the well. He disappears into the cellar. Then he comes back and calmly talks about underground water. Suddenly, his face or tone changes. There is someone else in this house. My father becomes tense. The two men go downstairs. My father opens the cellar door and tells the unseen person to leave. That night, he finally sleeps. No dramatic ending, no proof, just silence. Maybe silence was the whole point. My father did not need to see a shadow leave the property. He needed the house to feel normal again. After that night, it did. Years later, I can understand why our relatives remained skeptical. If someone told me today that underground water was disturbing their bed and that a dowser had detected a ghost, I would want to consider every ordinary explanation. First, sleep disorders, stress, medication, environmental conditions. Suggestion, coincidence, I would not treat an unseen presence as established fact. But I would also understand why the person who lived through it might remain convinced. Some experiences do not need to be supernatural to become permanent. The fear itself becomes part of the house. You remember which room you were in, which staircase someone used, which door was opened, which sentence changed the night. For my father, the sentence was not spoken by the dowser. It was the sentence he had to say himself. He had to stand in the cellar of an 1860 farmhouse, open the door, and tell whoever was there that this was his house and they needed to leave. Maybe nobody heard him except the dowser. Maybe nothing had ever been there at all. Maybe the only thing he drove out that day was the fear created by one terrible nightmare. If so, it worked. He slept. But my father has never believed he was speaking to an empty cellar. To this day, he believes someone had been in that house with us. And after weeks of being too frightened to sleep, he told it to leave. That same night, for the first time since the nightmare, he closed his eyes and nothing came back. I was around 17 when I had the last experience in that house that I could never fully explain. It happened late at night, just after I had gotten into bed. I usually slept with my bedroom door partly open because I liked having some light from the hallway. I did not leave it wide open, just enough that a narrow strip of light came into the room. That night, the door was probably a foot or two away from being completely closed. Nothing felt unusual. I was tired and had just settled into bed. I closed my eyes and started drifting towards sleep. I could not have been lying there for more than 30 seconds when I heard the bedroom door slam. It was loud enough to make me open my eyes immediately. At the same moment, the room went completely dark. My first reaction was annoyance, not fear. My younger brother, Eric, occasionally messed with me, and slamming my door while I was trying to sleep was exactly the kind of thing I could imagine him doing just to get a reaction. So I called out. Not funny, Eric. I expected to hear him laugh from the hallway. Maybe he would run away. Maybe he would push the door open again and admit he had done it. Instead, there was silence. I waited. Then I heard footsteps inside my bedroom. They were small footsteps, light, quick enough that I immediately thought of my brother again. For another moment, I was convinced he had somehow slipped into the room after closing the door. Maybe he had entered before I noticed and was now moving around in the darkness. I was still more irritated than frightened. I said something like, "Eric, get out of here, bro. I'm trying to sleep." Nothing answered. The room remained completely dark. Usually, if I stayed in darkness long enough, my eyes would begin adjusting. Shapes would appear. I would be able to make out the outline of the dresser, the closet, the door, or whatever light came through the window. That night, at least during those first moments, I could not see anything. The darkness felt solid. I listened carefully. My brother liked to joke around, but he was also somewhat afraid of the dark. That detail started bothering me. If he had come into my room just to scare me, I expected him to laugh or leave quickly. I did not believe he would stand silently in the middle of a pitch-black room after I had already called his name twice. The longer nothing happened, the less convinced I became that it was him. 5 or maybe 10 seconds passed. There was no movement, no breathing I could identify, no whispering, nothing from the hallway. I remained in bed trying to convince myself that my brother was still there and waiting for the right moment to scare me. Then I heard the paper. It sounded as though someone was standing in the center of my bedroom, about 3 feet away from where my head rested on the bed, slowly crumpling or crinkling a piece of paper. It was extremely clear. There was no uncertainty about the kind of sound. It was not a floorboard creaking. It was not fabric rubbing against itself. It was not a plastic bag somewhere across the room. It sounded like paper being squeezed in a hand. Crinkle, shift, crinkle. It lasted only around 3 seconds. But 3 seconds feels very long when you are lying in total darkness and you are convinced someone is standing only a few feet from your head. The hair on the back of my neck immediately stood up. That was when I became truly afraid. Until the paper sound, I had still been trying to force everything into an explanation involving my brother. The footsteps could have been Eric. The slammed door could have been Eric. The silence could have been him waiting to make me nervous. But the paper sound changed the feeling of the room. There was something about how close it sounded. Whoever was making it was not near the doorway. The sound came from inside the room, near the center, close enough that I believed I could have reached out from the bed and almost touched whoever was standing there. I stopped pretending I was brave. I remained still for a moment and listened. The crinkling stopped. Nothing replaced it. There were no footsteps moving away. No door opening. No sound of my brother laughing from the hall. Only silence. I had a flip phone at the time. Eventually, I worked up enough courage to reach for it. I opened the phone and used the screen as a weak light. Anyone who remembers those phones knows they were not exactly flashlights. The screen gave off just enough glow to see a small area nearby. I moved the light around the room, first beside the bed, then across the floor, then toward the center of the room where I had heard the paper. There was no one there. I kept moving the phone. Nothing. No brother. No person. No paper. I expected to at least find some object that could explain the sound. A wrapper. A sheet of paper. A bag. Something that had shifted or fallen. There was nothing in the area. I got out of bed and went to the light switch. Once the overhead light came on, I searched properly. I checked the entire bedroom. I looked under furniture. I checked behind anything large enough to hide someone. I opened the closet. There was nobody inside. I looked for my brother. Nothing. There was no obvious route he could have used to leave without opening the bedroom door. The door had slammed shut. I had been listening from the bed. If Eric had been inside and then escaped, I should have heard the door. If he had hidden in the closet, I would have found him. If he had crawled under something, there were not many places large enough, and there was still the paper. I searched for anything that could have produced that exact sound. I found nothing. That detail bothered me more than almost everything else. A lot of unexplained noises become easy to understand once the light is on. You hear scratching and discover a branch touching the window. You hear something fall and find an object on the floor. You hear rustling and realize a bag was moving near a vent. I could not find the source. The sound had been close, clear, and unmistakable. It sounded like paper being crumpled by someone standing near the bed, yet there was no paper lying there. I checked whether something could have fallen from a desk or shelf. Nothing had. I looked for loose paper that might have been caught by moving air. There was nothing in the place where the sound had come from. The slammed door had a possible explanation. A draft can close a door. Changes in air pressure happen when another door in the house opens or closes. A heating or cooling system can cause movement. Even a door that looks stable may swing shut if the hinges or frame are slightly uneven. At 17, I was not thinking about any of that. I thought someone had slammed it. But years later, I can admit that the door itself was probably the easiest part to explain naturally. Maybe the hallway pressure changed. Maybe another door closed elsewhere. Maybe the door had been slowly moving while my eyes were closed and finally reached the point where gravity pulled it shut. The noise may have sounded more forceful because I was lying in a quiet room. That explanation does not require my brother or anything paranormal. The footsteps are less certain. Houses make sounds that resemble footsteps all the time. Wooden floors shift. Pipes expand and contract. Someone walking elsewhere in the house can transmit vibration through walls and joists, making the sound appear much closer. If my brother was walking in the hallway or another room, I might have interpreted those sounds as footsteps inside my bedroom. Because I had already decided he slammed the door, my brain was prepared to hear him moving around. That expectation matters. Once you believe someone is inside the room, every small noise begins fitting that story. The paper sound is the detail I still struggle with. There are ordinary things that sound surprisingly similar to crumpled paper. Plastic packaging. A loose piece of fabric. A poster shifting on a wall. Dry leaves caught somewhere. A window blind. A bag slowly changing shape. Even electrical or heating noises can create short bursts of crackling that resemble paper. In darkness, without visual information, the brain identifies sounds using memory. Maybe something made a dry, crackling noise, and I labeled it paper. But I had heard paper crinkle thousands of times. This did not feel like a vague comparison. I remember knowing exactly what it sounded like. Someone was holding a piece of paper and squeezing it. The sound came in short movements, as though fingers were changing grip. That is how specific it seemed. The fact that my eyes had not adjusted to the darkness also probably increased the fear. I had only closed them for around 30 seconds before the door slammed, so my night vision had not fully developed. Once the hallway light disappeared, the room may have seemed much darker than it really was. That created the impression that I was completely blind while something moved around me. After a few minutes, I probably would have been able to see the furniture. But the entire experience happened before my vision caught up. That short period of blindness gave my imagination complete freedom. It is also possible I was closer to sleep than I realized. I had just closed my eyes. 30 seconds is enough time for someone who is exhausted to enter the earliest stage of sleep. People sometimes experience sounds or brief hallucinations while falling asleep. They may hear their name, footsteps, a knock, a bang, or even a voice that feels completely external. These are sometimes called hypnagogic experiences. They can happen to otherwise healthy people. A person may be partly awake and partly dreaming, with real surroundings mixed together with dream sounds. If the door truly slammed for some ordinary reason, that could have woken me during a transition into sleep. My brain might then have generated the footsteps and paper noise while I was still not fully awake. That would explain why there was nothing in the room afterward. But the experience felt continuous. The door slammed. I opened my eyes. I spoke to Eric. I heard footsteps. I spoke again. Then, after several seconds of silence, I heard the crinkling. I was thinking clearly enough to question whether my brother would remain in the dark. I remember making decisions. That makes it difficult for me to think of the whole event as a dream. Still, sleep-related experiences can feel exactly that coherent. A person can be convinced they are awake while part of the brain remains in dream mode. The fact that I was in bed and just starting to sleep makes that a serious possibility. There is also the possibility that Eric really was responsible for part of it. Maybe he did slam the door. Maybe the small footsteps were him leaving the hallway. When I called out, he stayed silent because he wanted me to think something was wrong. The paper noise could have been unrelated. If he later denied it, that would not prove much. Siblings sometimes keep a prank going because admitting it ruins the effect. I do not remember confronting him immediately afterward or getting a confession. If he had been outside the room the whole time, he could have caused the first sound and then walked away before I switched on the light. My fear might have connected the later noise to him. That explanation makes sense for the door and footsteps. But again, I heard the footsteps as though they were inside the room after the door had closed. I believe the sound moved across my floor, not down the hallway. Could sound have traveled strangely through the house? Absolutely. Could fear have changed my sense of direction? Yes, at night. Identifying where a quiet sound comes from is difficult. We rely on small differences between what each ear hears, and walls can reflect those sounds in confusing ways. A noise from outside the room could seem to come from inside. What I know is that I was convinced someone was there. I was so convinced that I spoke directly to my brother twice. That confidence did not come from seeing anyone. It came entirely from the sounds. The bedroom door slammed, then small footsteps, then paper. Each event seemed to bring whoever it was closer. The door told me someone had entered. The footsteps told me they were moving through the room. The paper told me they had stopped beside my bed. That sequence is probably why it frightened me so much. It felt intentional. It did not feel like three unrelated house noises. It felt like one person moving through a series of actions. Close the door. Walk toward the bed. Stand near my head. Crinkle something. Then disappear. That interpretation may have been created entirely by my brain. Humans naturally connect events into patterns. If three strange noises occur within 20 seconds, we assume they share a cause. They may not. The door could have closed from air pressure. The footsteps could have been my brother in another room. The paper sound could have come from a bag or wall somewhere nearby. Random events can line up perfectly enough to feel deliberate. I have had years to think about that. What makes the story more unsettling is what my sister later claimed happened in the same house. She had experiences that were far more visual than mine. According to her, she sometimes saw a tall man dressed in a suit sitting in the corner of her room. She described him as an actual figure, not only a shadow. I never saw him. I was never in the room with her when he appeared, so I cannot confirm anything about that part of the story. She may have been experiencing sleep paralysis, dreams, shadows, or something else. A tall man in a suit is also the kind of form a coat, standing object, or dark corner can become when someone wakes in low light. People frequently report human-shaped figures around sleep transitions. Our brains are extremely sensitive to faces and bodies. A few vertical lines in darkness can become a person instantly. But my sister believed what she saw was real. Her experiences apparently continued after mine had stopped. That created a strange contrast. My encounter with the slammed door was the last event I personally remember that felt paranormal. After that night, nothing comparable happened to me. No figures, no voices, no more objects moving, no more footsteps inside empty rooms. Whatever had happened, it did not become a continuing pattern in my life. That makes me lean toward a normal explanation. If something supernatural had deliberately entered my room, I would expect some repetition. Maybe not, but repeated activity would make the case stronger. Instead, I had one terrifying event, and then years of nothing. A single unexplained night is much easier to attribute to sleep, sound, airflow, and fear. At the same time, my sister's reports made me wonder whether I had briefly experienced something she was more sensitive to. If the house really had some kind of strange activity, perhaps it did not affect everyone equally. Maybe she noticed it regularly while I only encountered it once. That is a common idea in paranormal stories, although there is no way to prove it. I do not know whether the man in the suit had anything to do with what happened in my bedroom. I never saw a man. I never even saw a shadow. The sounds I heard were small enough to make me think of my younger brother rather than an adult. The footsteps were little. If anything was there, it did not present itself the same way it supposedly did to my sister. For all I know, the stories are unrelated. Her experiences may have been sleep-related. Mine may have been ordinary house noises interpreted while half asleep. Sharing a house does not automatically give separate strange events one supernatural cause. Still, the family connection made the memory harder to dismiss. I have tried to remember the exact layout of the room. Where was the paper stored? Was there a wastebasket? Were there posters? Could a bag have been hanging somewhere? Was a vent positioned near the center of the room? Could air from the closing door have disturbed something and caused the crinkling a few seconds later? That is possible. If the door slammed, it would have pushed air through the room. A loose piece of paper or plastic might react after a delay. Maybe it lifted, rubbed against another surface, and settled. By the time I turned on my phone, it had fallen somewhere I did not notice. I remember searching and finding nothing, but I was also frightened. My search may not have been as perfect as it felt. A small piece of plastic under the bed or behind furniture could easily escape notice. Even if I found paper elsewhere in the room, I might have rejected it because it was not exactly where I thought the sound originated. Sound location can be deceptive. This explanation connects the slam and the crinkling naturally. The door closes. The sudden airflow moves something. The object makes a paper-like noise. The footsteps in between may have been floorboards settling after the door's impact. That is actually a fairly strong possibility. A hard closing door sends vibration through the floor and walls. An old house can respond with several separate creaks. To a person expecting a prankster, those creaks may become small footsteps. Then, disturbed paper or plastic shifts. The entire sequence could come from one physical event. At 17, though, I did not know or care about structural vibration. I knew only that I had heard someone walk into my room. I heard them stop near my bed. Then I heard something moving in their hands. That memory has never changed much. I can still remember the exact sensation when the paper noise started. The fear moved through me immediately. My skin tightened. The back of my neck prickled. I stopped wanting to challenge my brother. The idea that this was a prank disappeared. All I wanted was light. The few seconds it took to reach for the flip phone felt much longer. There is something uniquely frightening about using a tiny phone screen to search a dark room. The light does not illuminate everything at once. It reveals only small sections. Each time you move it, you prepare yourself to find a face. I expected my brother to be crouched somewhere laughing. Then, I expected someone else. I found neither. Once the overhead light came on, the room returned to normal immediately. That transition always bothers me in memories like this. Darkness creates an entire threat. Light removes it without leaving evidence. The same floor is there. The same walls. The same closet. Nothing has changed except your ability to see. Yet the fear remains because you know what you heard before the light appeared. I searched because I wanted a physical answer. I would have preferred finding Eric in the closet. I would have preferred finding a sheet of paper under the bed. I would even have preferred discovering that the door hinge was broken. Anything would have given the experience an ending. Instead, there was nothing. No brother, no paper, no clear reason for the door to slam. Eventually, I had to go back to bed. I do not remember sleeping well after that. I probably left the light on or opened the door again. There was no way I was immediately returning to darkness and pretending nothing happened. For some time afterward, I was more aware of sounds in the house. If something shifted at night, I listened. If a door moved, I checked. But I never had another incident like it. As the years passed, the memory became something I could examine more calmly. I no longer say with certainty that something paranormal entered my room. There are too many ordinary possibilities. I had been falling asleep. The door may have closed naturally. My brother may have been somewhere nearby. The house may have produced noises. The paper sound could have come from an object I never identified. Fear may have turned several unrelated sounds into one invisible visitor. That is probably the most reasonable conclusion. But I am still certain about what the experience sounded like from the bed. That distinction matters to me. I cannot say there was definitely a person in the room. I can say I heard what sounded like one. I heard the door slam. I heard small footsteps. I heard a person standing about 3 feet from my head, crinkling paper for several seconds. Then I turned on a light and found nothing capable of doing it. Maybe my brain created part of the sequence while I was half asleep. Maybe the room itself created the sounds. Maybe the same house that my sister later said contained a tall man in a suit had something else going on. I do not know. And because nothing like it ever happened to me again, I probably never will. What stays with me is not the slammed door. A door can slam. It is not even the footsteps. Houses can sound like people walking. It is those final few seconds before I reached for my phone. I was lying completely still in darkness, no longer believing my brother was responsible. Something seemed to be standing in the center of my room, close enough to touch me. It made one small, ordinary sound, paper being crushed slowly in a hand. Then it stopped. When I finally found the courage to look, the room was empty, and there was no paper anywhere near where I had heard someone holding it.
So that's where we'll stop tonight. Before you go, remember this. Every story you just heard was real. Real people, real nights, and none of them saw it coming. If that got to you the way it gets to most people, do one thing before you leave. Hit subscribe. I post new stories all the time, and I don't want you to miss them. Take care of yourself. I'll see you next time.